You know, usually when we talk about something like a medical diagnosis, there's this underlying expectation of just absolute precision.
Right, yeah, like engineering.
Exactly, like engineering. I mean, if you fall and break your arm, you go to the hospital, they take an X-ray, and it shows that glaring, jagged white line across the bone. The doctor just points at the screen and says, well, there it is. That's the fracture.
It's completely binary. I mean, the bone is either broken or it is not broken. It's clean, it's simple, and above all, it's undeniable. You don't really sit there and have a philosophical debate with an X-ray machine.
Right, and there is something deeply comforting about that, isn't there? I think we really like things to be visible. We like things to be easily categorized.
We do.
We have this natural human desire to take these massively complex realities and just put them neatly into a little box with a clear, bold label right on the front.
Well, it's a survival mechanism in a way.
Yeah.
We crave that kind of definitive, easily digestible framework just to make sense of a world that is inherently chaotic. I mean, if we can label something, we feel like we can control it, or at least, understand our relationship to it.
But then you step out of the hospital and you walk into the world of human history and culture and this massive, sprawling reality of global migration. And suddenly that metaphorical X-ray machine is just completely broken.
Oh, completely.
The clean little boxes we use to label each other today, especially in our modern political discourse, they start to look completely inadequate. Because when you look at the deep history of humanity, we are looking at a landscape that is, well, honestly, it's incredibly murky.
Yeah, murky is probably the polite word for it. It is the absolute definition of muddy waters. I mean, the labels we rely on today, the ones we fight over on social media and in academia, they're incredibly recent inventions.
Right?
And we are basically trying to use these brand new, rigid little boxes to contain incredibly ancient, fluid, and complex realities.
And that tension right there between the ancient reality and the modern box is exactly what we are wading into today. So welcome to this deep dive.
It's going to be a big one.
It really is. Our mission today is to unpack a dense, highly provocative, and frankly fascinating essay titled Zera and the State, the Sovereignty of Source. We are going to be taking you, the listener, through a text that fundamentally detonates our modern categories of race.
Detonates is a good word for it.
It completely reworks the concept of cultural appropriation, and it questions the ultimate power, or I guess more accurately, the stripped limits of the power of the state itself.
And it's a text that pulls from an astonishingly wide range of disciplines. I mean, to build this argument, the author drags us through deep human history, the evolutionary origins of symbolic culture, the foundational architecture of American civic law.
Which is heavy on its own.
Very heavy, plus some very deep ancient theological concepts, and then eventually straight into the cosmic physics of light and relativity.
It is a massive intellectual journey. Now, just to be completely clear with you up front, because we are going to be touching on some highly charged political, cultural, and religious concepts today, our job here is not to tell you if this author is right or wrong.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because it's vital for how we approach this entire discussion. Our role is absolutely not to take sides here.
Right. As your guides, we are completely impartial.
Exactly. We aren't endorsing the views in this essay, nor are we condemning them. Whether your personal politics lean left-wing or right-wing or anywhere in the center, our only goal today is to act as cartographers.
We're just mapping it out.
We are strictly mapping out the fascinating arguments this author has constructed so you can understand the original material and, evaluate it for yourself.
We are just the messengers here breaking down the architectural blueprint of this argument. And the hook, the central thesis that the author builds this entire massive structure upon is this simple, defiant statement. The author says, I migrated, not appropriated.
Quite a statement.
It really is. Today, we are going to explore how this author completely separates the concept of true generative human life from mere state paperwork and what that separation actually means for how we view our society.
It's a profound reframing of the whole conversation. The author is essentially demanding what they call a Berean inquiry.
A Berean inquiry. Unpack that for us.
So in historical terms, that basically means a rigorous, critical, and totally independent examination of the facts. They're asking us to look very, very closely at what we are actually accusing people of when we throw around heavy words like appropriation.
Okay, so let's start with the foundation of the author's argument, which is all about escaping these modern category boxes we just talked about. The text argues that you and I, as modern people, are essentially trained from birth to think in present-day checkboxes.
Yeah, the ones on every form you fill out.
Exactly. You fill out a form, and there they are. white, black, indigenous, European, African, Asian, minority, majority, colonizer, oppressed. But the author's first major move is to say, hold on, humanity is vastly, vastly older than those boxes.
And they point straight to the deep historical and biological record to prove this. They also forces the reader to zoom out, way, way out. What's fascinating here is we are looking at the universally accepted anthropological fact that Homo sapiens, biologically modern humans, evolved in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago.
300,000.
Yeah, that is the true baseline beginning of the human story. It is a timeline so deep it renders any modern racial checkbox completely meaningless in the grand scheme of things.
I mean, 300,000 years, it's almost impossible for the human brain to genuinely conceptualize that amount of time.
It really is. You just can't picture it. And then the author layers on the next major milestone. The contemporary Eurasian population, which includes the ancestors of modern Europeans, Asians, and eventually the peoples of the Americas as well, that traces the vast majority of its ancestry to a massive dispersal out of Africa that happened about 50,000 years ago.
50,000 years. I mean, when you put it in that deep time context, calling someone merely European or white is just slapping a very recent, highly temporary label onto an incredibly ancient human movement.
That's exactly the author's point.
As I was reading this, a picture kind of popped into my head. It's like, okay, modern labels are like a generic shipping barcode slapped onto an ancient, priceless artifact.
Oh, I like that.
Right. The barcode tells you where the box is sitting right now, like in the warehouse of modern politics. But the receipt of the artifact itself, the actual story of its creation, well, that traces back thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it. The barcode is definitely not the object. And what's fascinating here is how the author describes these ancient human beings as they enter history and begin to move across the globe. They use this great phrase. They write that humans do not enter history as, quote, naked NPCs with empty backpacks.
I love that phrase so much. I really do. For anyone listening who might not, play video games, an NPC is a non-player character.
Right, the background character.
Yeah, it's just a blank, programmed entity standing in the background of a game, just waiting for the main character to arrive so it can deliver a line of dialogue. It has no history, no inner life.
Precisely. And the author is pushing back hard against this implicit assumption that ancient migrating peoples were just blank slates, that they only suddenly gained a quote-unquote culture when a modern political category or a modern nation-state was invented to describe them.
Because they were already fully human.
Right. The text insists that when those ancient humans dispersed 50,000 years ago, their backpacks were not empty. They carried fire. They carried highly sophisticated tool-making techniques. They carried deep memory, complex language, elaborate grief rituals for their dead, joyous celebrations, and a profound symbolic culture.
And the text doesn't just make that claim philosophically, right? I mean, it brings the receipts. They point specifically to the Blombos Cave in South Africa.
Yes, the Blombos Cave. This is crucial.
We are talking about archaeological discoveries of engraved ochre found there that confidently date back 75,000 to 100,000 years ago.
Yeah, the Blombos Cave ochre is a massive piece of evidence for this argument. Yeah. Now, ochre is a natural clay-earth pigment, and archaeologists found pieces of it that had been deliberately, intentionally engraved with these complex, cross-hatched geometric patterns.
Okay, so break that down for me, which means what exactly? For the listener who isn't an archaeologist, why does a scratched piece of clay matter so much to this argument?
It matters because it is undeniable, physical evidence of deep, abstract, symbolic human behavior. It means that 100,000 years ago, human beings were not just surviving, they were thinking symbolically.
They were creating meaning.
Yes, they were creating art, or keeping records, or conveying meaning through abstract geometry. And this was happening long, long before the modern racial imagination or the whole concept of a nation-state ever existed.
So the author is essentially setting a trap for modern identity politics here.
In a way, yeah, they really are. It creates a massive logical paradox for anyone claiming that culture is something that inherently belongs to modern political categories. Well, the author states that if culture is ancient, if it is inherently migratory, and if it is deeply symbolic by its very biological nature, then no modern group gets to pretend that culture only began when their preferred political label appeared in history.
Ah, I see. Because the receipt is longer than the label?
Exactly. The lineage predates the terminology. You cannot claim exclusive ownership over the concept of symbolic culture when your ancestors were already doing it tens of thousands of years before the concept of you even existed.
Wow. Okay, so if we accept this premise, this deep, ancient, continuous lineage of human culture, it naturally forces us to ask the next logical question.
Which is?
What happens when these ancient lineages with their full backpacks physically move across the globe and inevitably eventually collide with one another?
And that is exactly where the author takes us next, into the section they call the math of migration. And they emphasize right off the bat that migration is never, ever just empty movement.
Because of the backpacks.
Right, because of the backpacks.
Yeah.
Migration isn't just the logistical transportation of physical bodies from point A to point B. Migration transports the invisible architecture of humanity.
Invisible architecture.
Yeah, it transports deeply ingrained family structures, ancestral songs, ancient honor codes, architectural instincts, and agricultural technology. And when migrating people move, and they end up sharing geography with another group of people, their cultures inevitably touch. They interact.
And the text is very clear, we should note, that this contact isn't always pretty.
No, not at all.
The author isn't painting a utopian picture of multicultural harmony here. They explicitly state that the process of cultural collision can be incredibly sinful, violently exploitative, and just devastating.
Very true.
But they also note it can be lawful, covenantal, and beautiful. History is spectacularly messy. But the author's core philosophical point is that the mere fact that cultures influence each other is not by itself a crime. It is not by definition theft.
And to really nail this down, the text builds a very specific, almost algebraic mathematical model. Let's walk through it because it's completely central to the rest of the essay.
Okay, let's do the math.
Imagine a group of people. Let's call them Group 1. They arrive in a geography and establish themselves, bringing what we will call Culture 1. Then, centuries or even millennia later, another group, Group 2, arrives in that exact same geography, bringing their own deeply rooted history, which is Culture 2.
Okay, I'm tracking with the math so far. Group 1 and Group 2.
So Group 1 and Group 2 now share the same land. Over time, regardless of how fraught or violent their initial contact was, they inevitably begin to build together.
Because they have to.
Right, they have to survive. They trade, they establish overlapping laws, they reproduce, they intermarry, and over generations, they form a new, inextricably linked common life. The shared culture that emerges from that massive generational encounter is what the author calls Culture 3.
Right, and the author is stating that Culture 3, this new blended reality, is not automatically cultural appropriation.
Yeah.
The question the author wants us to ask isn't whether the cultures touched or borrowed from each other. I mean, of course they did. That's just human nature. The question is whether the descendants of the people who actually built that shared culture are later forbidden to inherit it.
And the author makes this abstract model intensely concrete by applying it directly to the history of the United States. In this specific national framing, Group 1 represents indigenous America, bringing Culture 1, their deep, complex, thousands of years old civilizational structures.
And Group 2?
Group 2 represents the Eurasian or European migratory settler line, bringing Culture 2.
Okay, here is where I want to hit pause.
Sure.
I need to push back on behalf of you, the listener, because this is where the essay walks right into the most heated debate in modern academia. The author is calling the European arrival Group 2. But wait, isn't calling European culture strictly colonizer culture the accepted default academic framing right now?
Yes, it is the dominant framing.
Doesn't the very word colonizer inherently make this entire story one of unidirectional theft rather than a shared math problem?
I'm really glad you brought that up, because the author directly anticipates and counters that exact objection. The text argues that reducing the entire Eurasian-European line strictly and exclusively to the word colonizer is a massive historical and philosophical error.
How so? Because a lot of people would say the historical record of colonization, the violence, and the taking of land is pretty undeniable.
The author isn't denying the historical record of conquest at all. What they're arguing is that reducing the entirety of the European route simply to a label of theft completely deletes the embedded generative reality of what actually formed Group 3, which is the United States.
So they're saying you're ignoring half the equation.
Exactly. The author argues that both groups brought profound, fundamental civilizational inputs that built the shared house.
So what are those specific inputs, according to the text?
Well, the European line didn't just bring conquest. It brought deep architectural traditions, complex common law, the printing press, specific farming methods, philosophical traditions of liberty, institutional frameworks, and yes, violence and sin, but also the mechanisms for repentance and covenantal claims based on a shared creator.
And on the other side,
Meanwhile, indigenous America brought its own profound culture, a deeply embedded relationship with the ecology of the land, ancient memory, vital survival skills, complex kinship networks, and its own rich civilizational forms.
I see. So the author is saying that Group 3, the United States, and Culture 3, our shared national culture, is formed from the massive, agonizing, and generative collision and combination of both those ancient histories.
Yes.
You know, it's like you can't bake a cake with flour and eggs and then centuries later claim the cake is only made of flour.
That's a great analogy, precisely. And this leads to a crucial distinction in the text. Group 3 does not erase Group 1 or Group 2. This isn't a story of replacement, it's a story of integration. Both original groups remain embedded within the new reality as constituent roots.
Root to fruit.
Exactly. The author describes it as a root-to-fruit relationship. The fruit, Culture 3, does not deny the root, and the root doesn't suddenly disappear just because the fruit has grown.
This logic really corners the modern accusation of cultural appropriation, doesn't it? I mean, if you follow the author's math, they're basically asking appropriation by whom and from whom.
Right.
If Group 1 and Group 2 built Culture 3 through a deeply shared history, through blood, through the establishment of law, through trade, and through intermarriage over centuries, how can the descendants of those builders be accused of stealing from the very house their ancestors built together?
That is the absolute core of the author's defense against the charge of appropriation in a national context. The thesis is beautifully simple. You cannot steal your own inheritance.
You cannot steal your own inheritance.
Right. If your lineage contributed to the building of the house, the artifacts inside that house belong to you as much as anyone else in the family.
Okay, so if Group 3, the United States, is the shared house we all live in, we need to examine the actual foundation it was built upon. What is the fundamental root of this shared civic life that allows all these disparate migrating groups to live under one roof?
And that takes us to the next major shift in the essay.
Right, where the author dives into the American civic root, the limits of the state, and this really fascinating ancient Hebrew concept of zera.
Yes. This is where the essay shifts pretty dramatically from historical anthropology into constitutional law and theology. The author states very firmly that the United States is not just a geography, it is not just a piece of fabric we call a flag, and it is certainly not just a government corporation or a bureaucratic state.
So what is it?
The root of the American civic claim is a very specific, very radical confession.
And they locate that confession right in the foundational document.
Yes, right in the Declaration of Independence. What's fascinating here is the author points directly to the phrase, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights."
The operative word there being creator.
Exactly. America's root civic culture, according to this text, is not based on blood and soil tribalism. It is not based on a caste system or skin color or a hierarchy of protected categories. It is based solely on the confession of created equality under God.
And the 14th Amendment backs that up, right?
They argue that the 14th Amendment of the Constitution takes this theological confession and gives it hard legal force. It literally forbids states from denying any person equal protection under the law.
So the spine of this entire argument is that human rights and human worth come from the Creator. The state is entirely downstream of that. The state is not the source.
Yes, absolutely.
So if I'm tracking with the math here, what does this actually mean for the average person interacting with the government today? I mean, it means the state can issue you a birth certificate, it can issue you a driver's license, it can manage the immense bureaucracy of your daily existence, but the state cannot create the life it is merely recording.
Bingo. And to anchor this philosophically, the author introduces a vital term from ancient Hebrew, the word zera.
Okay, break that down for me because this word seems to carry the entire weight of the essay's second half. What is zera?
So zera literally translates to seed, offspring, posterity, descendants, or fruitful continuation. It is the unbroken biological and spiritual line of generative life.
Seed.
Yes, seed. The text actually points to the book of Genesis, chapter 4, verse 25. That's where Eve, after the tragedy of Cain and Abel, talks about God granting her another seed, another zera, in place of Abel.
The author calls this the theological blade of the argument, right?
Yes, they are using it to basically slice through our modern assumptions.
Because zera isn't just a biological term here. The author says it's an ontological category. Now, ontological is a pretty heavy philosophy term. Let's unpack that for me and the listener. Are you saying it's not just a physical trait, but the actual fundamental essence of being human?
That is exactly what I'm saying, and it's what the author is driving at. Ontology is the study of the nature of being. So when the author calls Zera an ontological category, they mean it is a received, living lifeline that originates from outside human control.
It's the raw material of existence.
Exactly. And the author makes a very sharp, very deliberate, and I would say highly controversial distinction here between culture and Zera.
How do they differ?
Well, culture is real. It is vital. It carries memory, it shapes aesthetics, and it teaches children who they are and where they come from. But culture is ultimately an output.
An output.
Yes, it can be curated. It can be assembled by committees, branded with symbols, encapsulated in slogans, and shifted by trends.
But Zera can't be curated.
Exactly. Zera must be received. It is the living, physical, generative line of humanity. You can invent a culture, but you cannot invent a seed. You can only plant it, nurture it, or destroy it.
Which brings us to the actual mechanism of state power. How does the government interact with this ancient force of Zera? The author goes into some intense detail distinguishing between three legal and biological realities: birth, adoption, and wardship.
Let's define them according to the text because it's important. Birth is the seed line, the actual Zera. It is the generative origin.
Okay, and adoption.
Adoption is legal family incorporation. It's taking a life that already exists and grafting it into a new family structure through law and love. And then wardship is simply a custody line.
And where does the state fit into this equation?
The state operates strictly in the realm of custody. The legal term is parens patriae, which is Latin for parent of the nation. It basically means the state acts in a protective, sometimes paternal role over its citizens, especially those unable to protect themselves, like children.
So the state can manage custody. It can move children from a dangerous home to a safe one. It can recognize and legalize the beautiful act of parentage through adoption. It can move mountains of paperwork around to ensure a child is fed and sheltered.
Yes, it can do all of that, but, and this is the crux of the essay, the state cannot create Zera. It cannot create life. It is management, not sourcehood.
The author makes a pretty heartbreaking observation here, too. They note that on paper, the state calls its system child welfare or custody, but in the lived, visceral reality of a child bouncing around inside the foster system, it doesn't feel like family.
No, it feels like possession.
Right. It feels like medical control, school control, just being shuffled through bureaucratic checkpoints by strangers who didn't author your life.
It is deeply important to clarify here, as the author explicitly does, that this philosophical argument is absolutely not an insult to adopted families or foster parents.
Right. They're very careful about that.
Very, very careful. They state that adoption on an individual level can be a profound act of love, a miraculous rescue, and even a holy duty. The point the author is making is strictly about mechanism, source, and ultimate authority.
It's an argument against state overreach.
Exactly. It is an ontological argument designed to stop the state, the massive government bureaucracy, from pretending it is God. The state can legally recognize a family, it can facilitate an adoption, but it does not and cannot originate human worth.
Because if the state starts believing it is the source of human worth, it starts acting like a god rather than a manager.
Precisely.
And that vital distinction between the state merely managing the paperwork and the creator or nature providing the actual source of life, well, that sets the stage for probably the most explosive part of the essay.
Yeah, this next part is heavy.
How does a state that thinks it is a god handle groups of people today? This leads us directly into the concept of protected classes and the massive difference between a legal shield and a cultural hierarchy.
The author starts this section by affirming, right out of the gate, that protecting vulnerable classes of people from unjust discrimination is a fundamentally good, valid, and deeply American thing to do.
It acts as a shield.
Yes, as a shield. They specifically cite the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, guidelines in the workplace, and federal hate crime statutes.
Right, because if we look at how federal hate crime law actually works, it isn't just about policing offensive words or hurt feelings. It focuses on criminal acts.
Right, violence.
It focuses on willful bodily injury or violent attempts involving dangerous weapons, where the motive is tied to protected traits like race or religion. And in the workplace, for harassment to be illegal, it has to be severe or pervasive enough to create a truly hostile environment.
Exactly.
So as a shield, equal protection is designed to ensure the fair application of the law so everyone can go to work and walk down the street safely.
But the author issues a severe warning here. They call it a Trojan horse. The problem begins when that valid, necessary legal protection mutates, almost invisibly at first, into a cultural and legal hierarchy.
Okay, how does that mutation actually happen?
It happens when protection goes beyond ensuring equal standing and functionally becomes a grant of cultural immunity, speech privilege, and the exclusive authority to accuse other classes of appropriation.
Here's where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit uncomfortable for some, but I think we need to look at the real-world scenario the author is pointing at. Let's create a thought experiment for you, the listener.
Okay, let's do it.
Imagine a modern workplace, or a college campus, or even just the public square of social media.
Hmm.
Imagine two different people from two different racial or cultural backgrounds. Now imagine they engage in identical behavior.
Identical.
Identical. They use the exact same slang, they wear the same style of clothing, they tell the identical joke, or they voice the exact same political complaint.
Okay, I have the picture.
The author argues that if the exact same conduct is treated as harmless cultural expression when done by person A, but is immediately labeled violence, hate speech, or cultural appropriation when done by person B, then you no longer have equal protection under the law.
Because the standard is no longer the behavior. The standard is the identity.
Right.
If the moral weight of a word or an action changes solely based on the identity of the speaker, the practical rule of the society is no longer an equal principle. The practical rule has become class status. The author has a very sharp phrase for this. They call it caste logic with nicer vocabulary.
Caste logic with nicer vocabulary. Wow. And the text is very, very clear to point out. This is not a conservative argument for cruelty or a defense of using slurs.
Not at all.
It's a foundational, constitutional argument against unequal standards. If we have a society where one class is given a shield to protect them and another class is given a muzzle to silence them, we are directly violating the 14th Amendment's core promise of equal standing.
And if we connect this back to the bigger picture, the author returns to that mathematical model of groups we talked about earlier. Remember that. To show exactly how this double standard plays out with the specific accusation of cultural appropriation.
Right, let's refresh our memory on that. Group 3 and Culture 3.
Exactly. Remember, Group 1, the indigenous root, and Group 2, the European root, collided and built the shared national house, which is Group 3, the United States, and Culture 3.
Got it.
Now, the author introduces a new variable. Imagine a later, modern, protected identity movement that arises inside that shared house. They call this Group 4. And Group 4 creates its own distinct subculture, which we'll call Culture 4.
Okay.
Over time, this new group curates a composite culture. Let's call it Culture 5. And how do they build Culture 5? Well, by selecting, remixing, and borrowing elements from the foundation of the house from Cultures 1, 2, and 3.
They use the language, the institutional structures, the technology, the legal frameworks that were built by the original roots, which, as the author said earlier, is fine. Borrowing isn't inherently bad. Cultures remix and adapt all the time. That's just the math of migration.
Exactly. But here is where the paradox, the fatal double standard, arises. The problem occurs when Culture 5 receives special institutional shielding from the state, while simultaneously being granted the unilateral cultural authority to turn around and shame Cultures 1, 2, and 3.
Oh, I see. They use the shield as a sword.
Yes. They accuse the original builders of the House of Appropriation, while they themselves are standing on the floorboards those builders laid down.
It's literally like moving into a shared house, taking the furnishings from the living room to decorate your own bedroom, and then calling the cops to accuse the original owners of the house of stealing from you when they try to sit on the couch.
That is exactly it. That asymmetric cultural authority, the ability to borrow freely while strictly forbidding others from doing the same, is what the author views as a profound societal injustice and a massive corruption of equal protection.
And giving one group that kind of output power without requiring them to generate fundamental input creates a massive, totally unsustainable paradox. And this takes us into what might be the most structurally fascinating part of the essay.
The input-output paradox.
Right, or what the author ominously calls a nation consuming its seed.
This is where the text moves from legal theory into a highly structural, almost thermodynamic analysis of society. The author strictly defines two terms here. Input is defined as zero.
Remind us what that entails in this context.
Generative continuation, family formation, the actual biological reproduction of physical life,
Yeah.
population replenishment. It's the raw energy entering the system.
And output is defined as culture. The slogans, the identity politics, the parades, the celebrations, the institutional claims, the language, the bureaucracy, and the social power a group wield.
Right. Now, a healthy, enduring nation desperately needs both. It needs the cultural memory to guide it, but it needs the physical children to inherit it. It needs law, and it needs life. But the author warns of a fatal mathematical imbalance. When a nation decides to legally protect and elevate output, while simultaneously shaming, taxing, or neglecting input, the nation literally begins to eat itself.
The text calls this a sterile system. And by definition, a sterile system is a society or a subculture that produces massive amounts of cultural output like ideology, legal status, branding, digital media, but produces little to no zero, no actual physical life, by its own defining mechanism.
And this leads to a chilling mathematical formula presented in the text. Are you ready for it?
Hit me.
No zero input plus protected cultural output equals dependency throughput.
Okay, let's break that down because dependency throughput sounds a bit like corporate jargon, but the implications here are intense. I want to make sure I'm translating this right. It's like a company that spends millions of dollars on a massive marketing department, branding, and PR. That's the output. But they've completely shut down their manufacturing plant.
Right.
They aren't actually making a product anymore. To keep the lights on, they have to constantly borrow money or cannibalize their own assets.
That is a very accurate analogy. Now apply that to a society. If a highly protected cultural group, say Culture 5 from our previous model, does not produce its own living generation, if its birth rates collapse, well, it still has a massive appetite for cultural output.
Right. It still wants the parades and the institutions.
Exactly. So how does it survive? It must sustain itself by recruiting, affiliating, or adopting from the outside. The energy for the output must be supplied by someone. It has to pull life, labor, and zera for the generative roots, groups 1, 2, and 3.
So if the state steps in and artificially helps Culture 5 expand its output like funding its institutions, protecting its status, while simultaneously allowing Culture 5 to accuse the generative root cultures of historical guilt, inherited liability, or cultural appropriation,
then the state is actively feeding a protected output with the living root it is simultaneously dishonoring. The system is redirecting life that was generated elsewhere, creating a dangerous illusion of growth. The author says this is entirely smoke and mirrors. They describe it as, quote, classification without creation, custody without sourcehood, paperwork pretending to be life.
Why should you, listening to this right now, care about this input-output equation? Why does this matter beyond an academic debate? Because this fundamentally challenges how we view every institution in our society.
It really does.
Are we demanding that our courts, our schools, and our government protect our output, our curated identities, our digital avatars, our public branding,
Right.
while we entirely neglect the actual unglamorous input of life, family creation, and generative continuation?
The author's conclusion on this specific point is incredibly stark, and it's phrased almost like an unavoidable law of physics. They write, if a people has death but no birth, output but no zera, consumption but no replenishment, then the math is not mysterious. The line ends. No zera, no people, no nation.
It's a heavy, heavy warning. And to fully grasp the depth of this input-output argument, and to prove that this isn't just some localized political grievance about modern America, the author takes the reader completely out of the political realm.
Oh yeah, we go way out.
In the final stretch of the essay, they zoom all the way out to the physical structure of the universe itself.
Yes.
And I have to admit, when I first read this transition, I had to pump the brakes. I was like, hold up. We're jumping from HR departments and hate crime laws to Albert Einstein. You're losing me.
But the author insists this isn't a tangent.
Far from a tangent. The text includes an embedded essay called The Key Legend, and the author explicitly states this cosmic framework is the hidden operating system beneath their entire argument about migration and the state. This is where deep theology meets astrophysics.
It is wild. Walk me through it, slowly. They start by defining terms at a literal cosmic scale.
Right. They define God as life, light, and field, the ultimate generative uncreated source. The universe, on the other hand, is described as the parametered manifestation of that field. So they're setting up a strict boundary. God is not the universe, and the universe is not God.
Exactly. The author pushes back very hard against pantheism, the idea that the universe itself is divine. They argue a very specific philosophical point. To totalize the universe, to claim it is everything that exists, an observer would have to include themselves inside the object they are attempting to define.
Okay, and why is that a problem?
Because it means they no longer stand outside it as an objective final measure. Therefore, God is not just a dead pile of all the atoms that exist, but the living outside field that gives those atoms order.
And the universe is the parametered, limited expression of that field. The text plays with the literal etymology of the word universe, right? Universe, one verse.
Yes, and this is crucial. What's fascinating here is the author points out that a verse is, by definition, measured speech. Think of a poem or a song. It is not random, chaotic noise. It has cadence, proportion, rhythm, and a repeatable, lawful form.
Okay.
Therefore, the universe is a measured song. It is a lawful record. It is not an accident.
And this is where they bring in Einstein, which completely threw me at first. But they cite E equals mc squared as a physical witness to this theological idea. Explain to me how E equals mc squared has absolutely anything to do with cultural appropriation or the state.
It's about establishing that the universe is governed by unbreakable, lawful relationships, not arbitrary power. E equals mc squared proves that mass, energy, and light all belong to one unified, lawful order.
How so?
Matter, the physical stuff we're made of, is essentially just energy held in a measurable, temporary form. And the measure of that fundamental relationship is the speed of light squared. Light isn't just something that makes things pretty to look at. Light is the mechanism that makes the universe visible, measurable, and intelligible.
Okay, so the universe is lawful and light is the measure. This leads to some incredibly striking visual metaphors in the text that the author treats not just as poetry, but as literal truth, starting with the visible rainbow.
Right, the ROYGB rainbow. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet.
The author describes the visible rainbow in the sky as a covenant edge. What does that mean?
It means the rainbow isn't just a flat arc painted on the clouds. From the perspective of physics, a rainbow is a circular geometry formed entirely around the observer's specific witness point.
Wait, really?
Yeah, you only see the rainbow because of where you are standing in relation to the sun and the water droplets. You are inside the mathematical relation that makes the rainbow appear.
That's amazing.
And the text notes that the number 7, the 7 visible colors of the spectrum, has historically and theologically represented fullness, visible completion, and a covenant witness pointing back to the Creator, the source of the light.
But then the author contrasts that natural number 7 with the number 6. 6 is described as the human curation number, the register just before completion. The text argues that if you take a 6-fold public symbol, a 6-color flag, for example, and it is adopted by the state, repeated endlessly, and marched under as an ultimate symbol of identity, it can be read as a profoundly human-centered, rather than God-centered, palette.
And the text is careful to clarify here. This isn't because the concept of color itself is bad, or that every single graphic designer who ever made a 6-color flag was consciously intending cosmological rebellion.
Right, it's not a conspiracy theory.
No, the core issue is about source and direction. 7 receives the rainbow as an outward witness pointing up to God. 6, in this symbolic framework, severs that upward connection. It collapses the light inward, trapping it in human self-definition, political branding, and state-sponsored identity.
Okay, here is an analogy from the text that honestly blew my mind, but I want to make sure I understand it. The phrase inverse light cone. The author says, imagine yourself, the human being, as an inverse rainbow.
It is a beautiful, very complex image. Let's workshop it together.
So if a rainbow projects outward, an inverse rainbow takes everything in. You, the human being, download the entire universe inward. The world comes into you as light bouncing off objects, as sound waves, as a record of reality. Your eye receives it, your mind processes it, and it becomes memory. That memory eventually becomes a spoken word, that word becomes a shared culture, and that culture becomes the output we were talking about earlier.
That is exactly right. You are, as the author brilliantly states, a witness node of the field. Creation enters you as a lawful record, and it exits you as speech, action, physical building, and love.
And because every single human being operates this way, because we're all witness nodes, every human stands at their own local center of witness, which is where the author finally brings in the astrophysical concept of cosmic redshift.
Right. Redshift is the phenomenon where light from distant galaxies shifts toward the red end of the light spectrum because the universe is physically expanding. The space between us and them is stretching, so the light waves stretch out, turning redder.
And the author uses this to make a point about equality and perspective.
Exactly. Redshift proves that observation in the universe is relative, but it is strictly, universally lawful. From our vantage point on Earth, a distant galaxy appears redshifted. We are the center, they are the edge.
But if we flip it?
Right. If you were an observer standing on a planet in that distant galaxy looking back at us, Earth would be the distant red-shifted speck in your sky. You would be the center. Every single here is a valid center of record. Redshift is simply light carrying the mathematically perfect receipt of our relationship to each other.
So the rainbow on Earth and the redshift of the galaxies are rhyming concepts. They are completely different physical mechanisms, but they are both light records that absolutely require an observer and a measure. They prove the universe is a relational, measured song.
And they briefly mention gravity, too, adding it as the +1 curvature witness. It's not an eighth color to add to the rainbow, but it belongs to the exact same lawful order of relational measurement and curvature in spacetime.
So to bring this massive cosmic detour back down to Earth, why does the author take us on this wild journey through astrophysics and light? What does redshift have to do with my passport or my cultural identity?
They do it to synthesize their absolute foundational point. Nature is a lawful life order. The universe is governed by rules that existed long before us. And zero living, generative, biological seed flows strictly and exclusively through that lawful nature because the creator's life fills nature.
And the state.
The state, the government, the politicians, the bureaucracy exists entirely inside nature. It is a tiny recent invention. Therefore, the state cannot overrule nature. It cannot rewrite the laws of biology or physics, and it certainly cannot be the source of human life or worth.
And the author even redefines the concept of evil in this cosmic context. They use the ancient Hebrew word ra. The author argues that evil isn't some magical black substance floating around in space. Evil, ra, is simply the painful, inevitable consequence of violating this natural, lawful boundary. When you build a societal system that relies on bureaucratic paperwork instead of generative zera, when you prioritize a curated six-color cultural output over actual messy human life, you violate the fundamental order of the universe. And Ra, or consequence, is the unavoidable result.
The entire cosmic argument from E=mc² to the rainbow is a massive, unshakable foundation built to prove one simple, devastating point. The state is management, not source. God is upstream. Life is upstream. Nature bears witness to that upstream source. Human culture, identity politics, and the state are entirely downstream.
Wow. Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's take a breath and summarize the massive arc of this deep dive.
Yeah, it's been quite the journey. We started in the deep past with engraved ochre in a cave 100,000 years ago, establishing that humanity and symbolic culture are vastly older than any of our modern political labels.
We examined the math of migration, showing how moving peoples naturally blend and collide, making the shared national house a deeply rooted inheritance, not a scene of continuous theft.
We looked at the American civic root, discovering that the foundational claim of the nation is that rights come from a creator, not a government. We unpacked the profound ontological difference between zera, which is actual generative life, and state custody, which is merely the management of paperwork.
We analyzed the extreme danger of turning the shield of equal protection into a cultural hierarchy, warning that when one group gets a legal shield and another gets a cultural muzzle, the system collapses into caste logic.
We mathematically mapped the input-output paradox, showing how a nation consumes its own seed by protecting sterile cultural output while shaming the generative roots that actually built the society.
And finally, we looked at the literal physics of light, rainbows, and cosmic redshift to prove that the universe is a lawful, measured song, and the state cannot overrule the natural law of life. Life, rights, and zera come from God. The state merely manages the paperwork.
And because of all of that, from the caves to the cosmos, migration is not appropriation.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over on your own. We've spent this entire time talking about large-scale concepts, right? Nations, states, ancient history, and the universe. But think about our intensely modern, individualized digital lives for just a second.
Right.
We spend hours every single day on our phones. We generate avatars. We painstakingly curate social media feeds. And we build elaborate digital aesthetics to show the world who we are.
All of which, according to the author's strict definitions, is entirely 100% output.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is all output. If this author is right, that confusing state paperwork with actual life destroys a nation, what happens when we, as individuals, make that exact same mistake?
That's a great question.
What happens when we confuse our digital output with our actual physical existence? When we start caring more about the aesthetic branding of our lifestyle than the quiet, generative reality of our real-world families, our actual neighborhoods, and our physical communities?
It's a trap.
Are we unwittingly turning our own individual lives into sterile systems? Are we slapping a digital barcode on ourselves and forgetting the ancient, miraculous receipt of our own biology?
It raises a deeply uncomfortable but vital question about where we actually invest our finite human energy. I mean, are we building zero? Are we investing in life? Or are we just endlessly managing our own personal PR and paperwork?
It is a massive amount to chew on. Thank you for joining us on this exploration. Whether you agree with the author or completely reject their premise, there is a profound intellectual joy in uncovering the deep, sometimes cosmic architectures hidden beneath the everyday arguments we have on the news. Keep asking questions. Until next time.